The city lights sparkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet as David stepped out of his sleek black car. He adjusted his tie and took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs. Tonight was supposed to be special. After months of grueling negotiations and countless sleepless nights, his tech company had finally closed the biggest deal of his career. A major corporation had acquired his startup for an amount that still made his head spin when he thought about it. Standing beside him was Rachel, her hand slipping naturally into his as they walked toward the entrance of the Skyline restaurant. The place was legendary in their city, perched on the 42nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view most people only saw in movies. David had made the reservation 3 weeks ago, back when the deal was still just a hopeful possibility. Now it was real, and he wanted to celebrate properly with the woman who had stood by him through the final, most stressful months of the process. Rachel looked stunning tonight. She wore a deep blue dress that complemented her dark hair, which fell in soft waves past her shoulders. She was a marketing executive at a different firm, so she understood his world in a way his previous partners never had. She knew about the late-night calls, the weekend emergencies, the times when his mind was physically present but mentally still stuck in a boardroom somewhere. For 8 months now, they had been together, and David was starting to believe he had finally gotten the balance right. The restaurant's host greeted them with the kind of warm professionalism that came from years of serving people who expected excellence. He led them through the dining room, past tables where other successful people sat in their expensive clothes, speaking in hushed tones about deals and vacations and whatever it was that occupied the minds of those who had made it. David felt a quiet pride walking through that space. 10 years ago, he had been eating ramen noodles in a studio apartment, writing code until 3 in the morning, convinced he was going to change the world even though his bank account suggested otherwise. Their table was perfect, positioned right by the window where they could see the entire city spread out beneath them. Tiny cars moved along the streets like blood cells through veins, and other buildings stood tall and proud, their windows glowing with life. David pulled out Rachel's chair and she smiled at him as she sat down. That smile still did something to him, made his chest feel warm in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. A waiter appeared almost immediately, younger than David, but carrying himself with practiced grace. He presented them with leather-bound menus and asked if they would like to start with something to drink. David ordered a bottle of champagne without even looking at the price. Tonight was not a night for hesitation or second-guessing. Tonight was about celebration, about acknowledging that all those years of sacrifice had actually led somewhere. Rachel looked at him across the table, her eyes reflecting the candlelight that flickered between them. She reached across and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice soft but genuine. "You worked so hard for this." David felt his throat tighten slightly. He wasn't used to praise, not the real kind that came from someone who actually understood what the journey had cost. "We worked hard," he corrected her. "You were there through the worst of it. All those times I had to cancel plans, all those weekends I disappeared into my office. You could have walked away." "But I didn't," Rachel said simply, "because I saw what you were building. Not just a company, but something you believed in." The waiter returned with the champagne, performing the ritual of presenting the bottle, opening it with barely a whisper of sound, and pouring 2 perfect glasses. The bubbles rose in delicate streams, catching the light. David picked up his glass and waited for Rachel to lift hers. "To new beginnings," he said, the words feeling both appropriate and somehow inadequate for the moment. "To new beginnings," Rachel echoed, and their glasses met with a soft clink. The champagne was everything it should be, crisp and clean with just the right amount of complexity. David took a sip and felt himself starting to relax for what seemed like the first time in months. The tension he had been carrying in his shoulders began to ease. His mind, which usually raced ahead to the next problem or opportunity, actually settled into the present moment. They ordered their food, taking their time with the menu, debating between options like people do when they know the evening is meant to be savored, rather than rushed. Rachel chose the sea bass and David went with the ribeye, medium rare. The waiter nodded approvingly at their selections and disappeared to place their order. "So what happens now?" Rachel asked, leaning back in her chair. "Now that the deal is done, I mean. Do things slow down? Or is this just the beginning of something even bigger?" David considered the question. He had been so focused on reaching this milestone that he hadn't really allowed himself to think much beyond it. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, he admitted. The acquiring company wants me to stay on as head of my division, which is great. But it also means new responsibilities, new pressures, different than before but not necessarily easier. But you'll have more support now, Rachel pointed out. More resources. You won't be doing everything yourself anymore. True, David agreed. He swirled the champagne in his glass, watching the bubbles dance. It feels strange, you know? I've spent so long fighting to survive, to prove that my idea was worth something. Now that I've done it, there's this weird, empty feeling. Like I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be fighting for anymore. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe now you can actually enjoy what you've built instead of constantly worrying about losing it. David was about to respond when something caught his eye. Movement at the bar across the room. Someone standing up from their seat. He glanced over casually, the way people do in restaurants, not really looking at anything in particular, and then his entire body went still. Sitting at the bar alone was someone he had not expected to see, someone he had not seen in 5 years, someone whose face he had tried very hard to forget but had never quite managed to erase from his memory. His ex-fiancée. Here, in this restaurant, on this night of all nights, she was nursing what looked like a martini, staring down at her phone with an expression he couldn't quite read from this distance. But even across the dimly lit restaurant, even after all this time, he recognized her instantly. The way she held herself, the curve of her shoulders, the particular way her hair fell across her face. His hand, which had been reaching for his champagne glass, froze in midair. His heart, which had been calm and content just moments ago, suddenly began to pound in his chest. The room seemed to tilt slightly as if the building itself had shifted beneath him. David? Rachel's voice cut through the fog in his mind. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. He forced himself to look back at her, to focus on the concerned expression on her face. I'm fine, he said automatically, but his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. Just thought I saw someone I knew. Rachel turned in her seat, following his earlier line of sight toward the bar. Who? She asked, curiosity evident in her tone. David's mind raced. What were the chances? In a city of millions, in a restaurant he had chosen specifically because it was new and trendy, and not somewhere he had ever been before. She was here. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor he did not appreciate. He picked up his water glass and took a long drink, trying to steady himself. This was fine. This was nothing. She probably hadn't even seen him. There was no reason this had to become anything more than a strange coincidence. David tried to focus on the menu in front of him, but the words blurred together into meaningless shapes. Across the room, sitting at that bar, was Jennifer, the woman he had almost married, the woman who had walked out of his life 5 years ago with words so sharp they still cut when he remembered them. Rachel was still looking at him, waiting for an answer to her question about who he had seen. He forced a smile and shook his head. Nobody important, just thought it was someone from work. But it was a lie, and he could tell Rachel sensed it. She had that intuition that came from really paying attention to someone. Still, she didn't push, just gave him a curious look before turning her attention back to the wine list. David risked another glance toward the bar. Jennifer hadn't noticed him yet. She was scrolling through her phone with one hand while the other held her drink. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders curved slightly forward as if she was trying to make herself smaller. She looked different than he remembered. Older, obviously, but also something else. Tired maybe, or sad. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. The memories came flooding back whether he wanted them or not. Jennifer had been his first serious relationship, the first woman he had actually imagined a future with. They had met at a tech conference 7 years ago, back when he was still working for someone else and dreaming about starting his own company. She worked in finance, sharp and ambitious, and they had clicked immediately. Within 6 months, they had moved in together. Within a year, he had proposed. But then everything changed. David left his stable job to start his company, and suddenly their comfortable life became anything but comfortable. He worked from home, which really meant he worked from their tiny apartment, filling their living space with computer equipment and turning their dining table into his office. He stopped coming to bed at reasonable hours. He canceled date nights. He forgot anniversaries. His entire world shrank down to lines of code and investor pitches and the constant, gnawing fear that he was going to fail. Jennifer had been patient at first. She understood ambition because she had plenty of her own, but patience has limits and he kept pushing past them. The fight started small, little comments about him not pulling his weight around the apartment or missing dinner again. But they grew bigger, louder, more painful. She said he cared more about his company than about her. He said she didn't understand what he was trying to build. She said if he really loved her, he would find balance. He said if she really loved him, she would support his dream. The final fight happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. David had been awake for 36 hours straight, trying to fix a critical bug before a presentation to potential investors. Jennifer came home from work and found him exactly where she had left him that morning, surrounded by empty coffee cups and protein bar wrappers, still in his pajamas. She stood in the doorway and gave him an ultimatum that still echoed in his mind 5 years later. "Choose," she had said, her voice shaking with emotion, "me or this company, because I can't keep coming in second place to a startup that might not even exist in a year." David had looked at her, exhausted and stressed and scared about the presentation, and he had made his choice. He didn't say anything. He just turned back to his computer, and that silence was answer enough. Jennifer packed her bags that night. She left the engagement ring on the kitchen counter, and she told him he was selfish. She told him he was so obsessed with building something successful that he couldn't see what he was destroying. She told him he would end up alone, and that one day he would realize money and success weren't enough to keep him warm at night. Then she walked out and he hadn't seen her since. For months after, David threw himself even harder into his work. He told himself Jennifer was wrong, that she just didn't understand what it took to build something from nothing. He told himself he was better off without someone who couldn't support his vision. But late at night, when the code wouldn't work and the investor said no and the money ran dangerously low, he wondered if she had been right. He wondered if he was destroying himself chasing something that might never materialize. But then things started working. The company grew. The investors came. The success he had sacrificed everything for actually happened. And somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that it was all worth it, that he had made the right choice. Now here she was, less than 50 feet away, and all those old feelings came rushing back like water through a broken dam. "David, seriously, what's wrong?" Rachel's voice pulled him back to the present. "You keep staring off into space." He looked at her. This woman who had been so good to him, so understanding of his crazy schedule and unpredictable life. Rachel was everything Jennifer hadn't been: patient, supportive, willing to adjust to his needs. But even as he looked at her, he couldn't stop his eyes from drifting back to that bar. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "I guess I'm just processing everything. The deal, the changes coming, all of it. It's a lot." Rachel reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I know it is, but you don't have to process it alone. I'm here." The waiter arrived with their appetizers, some fancy arrangement of scallops and microgreens that probably cost more than David used to spend on groceries for a week. He picked up his fork, determined to focus on the present, on this celebration, on the woman sitting across from him who deserved his full attention. But then Jennifer moved. She stood up from her bar stool, a bit unsteady, and for a horrible moment David thought she was going to leave. Part of him felt relieved at the thought, but she didn't head for the exit. Instead, she signaled the bartender for another drink. She was alone on what looked like drink number 3, in a fancy restaurant on a Thursday night. That wasn't like her. At least it wasn't like the her he had known. Questions filled his mind. Why was she here? Was she meeting someone? Was she married now? Happy? Did she ever think about him? Did she regret leaving? Did she know his company had succeeded? That everything he had sacrificed their relationship for had actually paid off? Rachel was telling him a story about something that happened at her office, and he nodded at what he hoped were the right moments, but he only caught about half the words. His mind was split between two different versions of his life, the one sitting in front of him with champagne and celebration, and the one at the bar nursing a martini and looking like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. "You're not listening to me at all, are you?" Rachel said, but her tone was more amused than angry. David had the decency to look embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I really am. You were talking about your new client." "That was 5 minutes ago," Rachel said. She studied his face carefully. Okay, what's really going on? And don't say nothing because I know you better than that. David opened his mouth to deny it again, but something in Rachel's expression stopped him. She wasn't angry. She was concerned. And she deserved better than lies, even small ones told to protect a perfect evening. But before he could figure out what to say, Jennifer turned around. Maybe she felt someone watching her, or maybe it was just terrible timing, but she turned and her eyes swept across the restaurant, and then they landed on him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The recognition on her face was instant, followed by something that looked like shock or maybe fear. Her martini glass froze halfway to her lips. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background, until all David could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Jennifer lowered her glass slowly. Even from across the room, he could see her chest rise and fall with a deep breath. Then, incredibly, she started walking toward him, not toward the exit, not back to her seat, but directly toward his table. Rachel noticed his expression change and turned in her seat to see what he was looking at. "Who is that?" she asked. David couldn't answer. He watched Jennifer navigate between tables, moving with the careful precision of someone who had consumed just enough alcohol to make them bold, but not enough to make them reckless. She wore a black dress that was elegant but simple, and her hair was shorter than he remembered. She looked sophisticated and sad at the same time, if such a combination was possible. When she reached their table, she stopped and looked down at him. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and charged with history that Rachel couldn't possibly understand. Finally, Jennifer spoke. "David," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it. It's been a long time. David's mouth went dry. He had imagined this moment countless times over the years, rehearsed different versions of what he would say if he ever saw Jennifer again, but now that she was actually standing in front of him, every carefully prepared word vanished from his mind. "Jennifer," he managed to say, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. "Yeah, it has been." Rachel's eyes moved between them, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding. She wasn't stupid. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the way David had suddenly gone pale told her everything she needed to know about who this woman was. Jennifer's gaze flickered to Rachel, then back to David. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. Regret maybe, or curiosity, or perhaps just the haziness that came from sitting alone at a bar on a Thursday night. "I saw you from over there," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the bar. "I wasn't sure if I should come over, but I thought it would be more awkward to just leave without saying anything." "Right," David said, because what else could he say? His brain felt like it was running through mud, every thought taking twice as long as it should. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Rachel sat perfectly still, watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to piece together a puzzle. Jennifer stood there, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, clearly second-guessing her decision to walk over. Finally, David's manners kicked in, overriding his shock. "Jennifer, this is Rachel. Rachel, this is Jennifer. We used to know each other." "We were engaged," Jennifer said bluntly, and David wanted to sink through the floor. Leave it to her to cut straight through any pretense. That had always been her way. Direct, honest, sometimes painfully so. Rachel's eyebrows rose slightly, but to her credit, she recovered quickly. She extended her hand across the table. "It's nice to meet you," she said, her voice polite but cool. Jennifer shook her hand briefly. "You too." She looked back at David, and something in her expression softened. "I heard about your company. The acquisition. It was all over the business news. Congratulations, you actually did it." "Thanks," David said. The word felt inadequate, but he didn't know what else to offer. Here was the woman who had told him his dream was destroying him, acknowledging that the dream had come true. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Would you like to sit down?" The words came out of his mouth before he could stop them. He immediately regretted them, seeing Rachel's face tighten slightly. But it was too late to take them back. Jennifer hesitated, glancing at Rachel again. "I don't want to intrude on your evening." "You're not," David said, even though they all knew that was exactly what was happening. He pulled out the empty chair at their table, the one that had been sitting there unused. Just for a minute, Jennifer sat down slowly, placing her clutch on the table. "Up close," David could see the small changes that 5 years had carved into her face. Fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. A certain weariness in her expression that was new. But she was still beautiful in that sharp, polished way she had always been. The waiter appeared, looking uncertain about the change in their party size. David ordered Jennifer a water, figuring she probably didn't need another martini, and the waiter disappeared gratefully. "So," Jennifer said, breaking the awkward silence. "This is strange, isn't it?" David let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's one word for it." Rachel picked up her champagne glass and took a long sip, her eyes never leaving Jennifer's face. David could practically see the wheels turning in her mind, wondering about the history between them, probably worried about what Jennifer's sudden appearance might mean. "I come here sometimes," Jennifer said, as if she needed to explain her presence, "when I need to think. The view helps. Makes your problems seem smaller when you're looking down at the whole city like that." "I wouldn't have pegged you for a regular here," David said. "This place only opened about 6 months ago." "A lot has changed in 5 years," Jennifer said quietly. She looked down at her hands, and David noticed something that made his stomach drop. Her left hand was bare. No wedding ring. No engagement ring. Nothing. The waiter brought the water, and Jennifer thanked him, taking a long drink. The silence stretched out again, and David scrambled for something to say. Anything to fill the space. "Are you still in finance?" he asked, falling back on safe professional topics. "Yeah," Jennifer said. "I made partner at my firm 2 years ago. Finally." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Turns out I'm pretty good at the career thing when I'm not distracted." The barb was subtle, but David felt it anyway. Rachel definitely caught it too, based on the way she set her glass down a little harder than necessary. "That's great," David said, meaning it despite the awkwardness. "You always wanted that." "I did," Jennifer agreed. She played with the edge of her napkin, folding and unfolding it. "I threw myself into work after we split up. Figured if you could do it, so could I. 70, 80-hour weeks, weekends in the office, the whole thing." She paused, looking up at him. "I finally understood what you were chasing. The high of building something, of proving yourself. It's addictive, isn't it?" David didn't know how to respond to that. Rachel shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I got married," Jennifer said suddenly, as if she couldn't hold the words in anymore. 2 years after we broke up. Richard. He was a lawyer, very successful, very stable. Everything I thought I wanted." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "We were divorced within 2 years. Turns out when you marry someone to prove a point to yourself, it doesn't usually work out." "Jennifer, I'm sorry," David said, and he genuinely was. Whatever had happened between them, he had never wanted her to be unhappy. "Don't be," she said, waving off his sympathy. "It was my mistake. I think I was trying to replace what we had, but you can't do that. Every relationship is its own thing." She glanced at Rachel. "I'm sure you know that." Rachel smiled tightly. "I do." Jennifer took another sip of water, and David could see her working up to something, gathering courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than before. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking directly at David. "For what I said when I left. I called you selfish. I said you would end up alone and miserable. I was angry and hurt, and I wanted to hurt you back." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I was wrong. You weren't selfish. You were just committed to something I couldn't understand at the time. And I'm sorry I didn't support you when you needed it." David felt like someone had punched him in the chest. Of all the things he had imagined Jennifer might say if they ever met again, an apology had never made the list. He had spent years telling himself she was wrong about him, but part of him had always wondered if maybe she had been right. Hearing her take it back now after all this time stirred up emotions he thought he had buried. "You don't have to apologize," he said quietly. "I wasn't easy to be with back then. I was obsessed. You had every right to want more than I could give you." "Maybe," Jennifer said. "But I gave you an ultimatum when I should have just been honest about my feelings. I made you choose between me and your dream, and that wasn't fair. Nobody should have to make that choice." Rachel was watching this exchange with an expression David couldn't quite read. He knew he should probably say something to include her, to remind everyone at the table that she was his present, not Jennifer. But the moment felt frozen, suspended in time. "I read about your success," Jennifer continued, And I was genuinely happy for you, not in a bitter I told you so way, but really happy. You deserved it after everything you put into it. And seeing you here tonight, looking successful and—" She glanced at Rachel. "And happy. I just wanted you to know that I was wrong to judge you the way I did." David's throat felt tight. "I appreciate that, really." Jennifer finished her water and picked up her clutch. "I should go. I've already interrupted your celebration enough." She stood up, smoothing down her dress. "It was good to see you, David. And Rachel, it was nice meeting you. Take care of him. He's one of the good ones, even if he forgets to come up for air sometimes." Rachel nodded but didn't say anything. Jennifer turned to leave, took 2 steps, then stopped. She turned back to face David, and there were tears in her eyes that she was fighting to keep from falling. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think about that night sometimes. The night I left, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. If I had been patient just a little longer, if I could have been there to celebrate this with you." Then she walked away, heading toward the exit this time, leaving David sitting there with his current girlfriend and the ghost of a life that might have been. The silence that followed Jennifer's departure was deafening. David sat frozen in his chair, staring at the spot where she had been standing moments before. His mind was racing, replaying every word of their conversation, every look, every unspoken meaning hanging in the air between them. Rachel set down her champagne glass with deliberate care. The celebration they had come here for felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. The bubbles in their glasses had gone flat, much like the mood at their table. "So," Rachel said finally, her voice carefully controlled, "that was your ex-fiancé?" It wasn't a question, but David nodded anyway. "Yeah, that was Jennifer. An old friend," Rachel said, and there was an edge to her voice now. "That's what you called her earlier." When I asked who you were staring at, David winced. "I know, I'm sorry. I didn't know what to say. I was shocked to see her here." "Shocked," Rachel repeated. She picked up her napkin and folded it carefully, placing it beside her plate. "You looked more than shocked, David. You looked like your whole world just tilted sideways." He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but lying would only make things worse. Rachel was smart enough to see through it anyway. "It's been 5 years since I've seen her. 5 years since we spoke. You have to understand, she was a huge part of my life once. Seeing her again, hearing her apologize like that, it brought back a lot of memories." "I could tell," Rachel said quietly. She finally looked at him, and the hurt in her eyes made his chest ache. "Do you still have feelings for her?" The question hung between them like a blade. David opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. He needed to be careful here. Needed to be honest, but also reassuring. The problem was he wasn't entirely sure what the honest answer was. "I don't know what I feel right now," he admitted. "I'm confused. She was part of one of the hardest periods of my life. We had something real. And then it ended badly, and I spent years convincing myself that it was all for the best. And now she shows up and tells me she was wrong, that she's sorry, and You just what?" Rachel pressed. "I don't know," David said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel or think or do with any of this." Rachel studied his face for a long moment. "She still loves you. You know that, right? That whole speech about being wrong and wondering what if, that wasn't just an apology. That was her telling you she made a mistake letting you go." David hadn't wanted to acknowledge that, but hearing Rachel say it out loud made it impossible to ignore. "Maybe," he said weakly. "Not maybe," Rachel said firmly. "Definitely. I saw the way she looked at you. I heard the way her voice changed when she talked about that night she left." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "And I saw the way you looked at her." "Rachel, I love you," David said, reaching across the table for her hand. She let him take it, but her fingers remained limp in his grasp. "What Jennifer and I had was years ago. You're my present. You're my future. Am I?" Rachel asked, and the vulnerability in her voice cut him deeper than anger would have. "Because sitting here right now, I feel like I'm competing with a ghost. And the scary part is I'm not sure I'm winning." David squeezed her hand. "You're not competing with anyone. Jennifer is my past. We didn't work out for a reason, but she apologized for that reason," Rachel pointed out. "She basically said if she could do it over, she would make different choices. And you're sitting here saying you don't know how you feel about that." The waiter appeared with their entrees, setting the plates down with impeccable timing that somehow made everything worse. The ribeye that David had been looking forward to now looked completely unappetizing. Rachel stared at her sea bass like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. "Would you like anything else?" the waiter asked, oblivious to the tension at the table. "We're fine." "Thank you," Rachel said, her voice tight. The waiter left, and they sat there with their expensive meals growing cold in front of them. David picked up his fork, then set it back down. He had no appetite. "I need you to be honest with me," Rachel said. "Not the version of honesty where you tell me what you think I want to hear. The real, actual truth." David looked at her, this woman who had been so patient with him, so understanding of his demanding schedule and his obsessive nature when it came to work. She deserved honesty, even if it was complicated and messy. "The truth is," he began slowly, "seeing Jennifer tonight stirred up a lot of old feelings. Guilt mostly, regret about how things ended, questions about whether I made the right choices back then." He paused, making sure Rachel was really listening. "But those are feelings about the past. They don't change what I have with you in the present." "Doesn't it, though?" Rachel asked. "Because if you're sitting here questioning the choices you made, that means part of you wonders if you should have chosen her instead of your company. And if you chose wrong then, maybe you're choosing wrong now by being with me instead of trying to fix things with her." "That's not what I'm saying," David protested. "But it's what you're thinking," Rachel said. "I can see it in your face. You're wondering what if she had stayed? What if you had made more time for her? What if you could have had both the company and the relationship?" David couldn't deny it because it was true. Those exact thoughts had been running through his mind since Jennifer walked away. "I'm human," he said. "Is it really so wrong to wonder about the past?" "No," Rachel said. "But it becomes wrong when you're supposed to be celebrating your future with someone else." She pulled her hand away from his and placed it in her lap. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about your answer before you give it to me." "Okay," David said, his heart sinking. If Jennifer walked back in here right now and said she wanted another chance, that she was willing to support your work this time, that she wanted to try again, what would you say? The question hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to immediately say no. That of course he would choose Rachel, but the word stuck in his throat, because he wasn't sure. And that hesitation, that brief moment of uncertainty, was all the answer Rachel needed. She stood up, placing her napkin on the table. "I think I need some air." "Rachel, wait," David said, standing up as well. "Don't leave like this." "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just need a few minutes to clear my head. I'm going to go to the restroom and compose myself, and then we can talk about this like adults." She picked up her purse. "But David, you need to use these few minutes to figure out what you actually want." "Because I'm not going to sit here and be second choice to a maybe." She walked away before he could respond, heading toward the restrooms at the back of the restaurant. David sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. The evening that was supposed to be a celebration had turned into a disaster, and he had no one to blame but himself. He pulled out his phone without thinking, scrolling through old photos. He found one from 3 years ago, during the darkest period of his company's early days. Rachel had brought him dinner at his office at midnight, had sat with him while he worked, had told him she believed in him when he was ready to give up. She had been there for him through struggles Jennifer never knew about, but Jennifer had been there for different struggles. She had been there when he made the leap from stable job to terrifying startup. She had been there for the fear and the excitement and the pure, desperate hope of those early days. She knew what it cost him to choose his dream over their relationship because she had paid that price too. His phone buzzed with a notification. An email. He almost ignored it, but something made him look. It was from Jennifer. The subject line was simple. "I shouldn't have said that." David's finger hovered over the email. Opening it felt like crossing a line, but his curiosity won. The message was short. "David, I'm sorry for making things awkward tonight. I had too much to drink and too many regrets. Seeing you successful and happy reminded me of what I gave up, and I shouldn't have laid that at your feet. You've clearly moved on, and you should. Rachel seems lovely, and you look at her the way I always wanted you to look at me. Don't mess that up by dwelling on the past. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Take care of yourself." David read the message 3 times. Here was Jennifer, giving him permission to move on, telling him not to dwell on their past. But was that what he wanted? Or was he looking for an excuse to reopen that closed door? He looked up and saw Rachel emerging from the restroom. She had fixed her makeup and composed her expression, but he could still see the uncertainty in her eyes as she walked back to the table. She sat down, folding her hands in front of her. "Okay," she said. "I'm ready to talk." David put his phone away. "Rachel, let me go first," she interrupted. "I've been thinking while I was in there, and I need to say something." She took a deep breath. "I love you, David, I really do. But I won't be with someone who's halfway out the door, who's comparing me to someone else, who's wondering if they made a mistake being with me. You need to decide what you want, and you need to be absolutely sure about it." "I want you," David said, but even as the words came out, he heard the slight hesitation in his own voice. Rachel heard it too. "Do you? Or do you want what we have because it's comfortable and easy and I don't challenge you the way she did?" The question struck at something David had been avoiding. Rachel was easy to be with because she accepted him as he was. Jennifer had pushed him, challenged him, demanded more from him. Both had value, but they were different kinds of love. "I need time to think," he said finally, hating himself for the admission. Rachel nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. "Then I think we're done here." She stood up again, this time picking up her coat. "Take all the time you need, David, but don't call me until you're absolutely sure about what you want. I deserve someone who chooses me without hesitation." "Please don't go," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I have to," Rachel said softly, "for both of us." She leaned down and kissed his forehead gently. "Congratulations on your success. You really did earn it." Then she was gone, leaving David alone at a table set for celebration, with 2 full plates of cold food and more questions than answers. David sat alone at the table for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The waiter came by twice asking if everything was all right, and both times David waved him away. Around him, other couples laughed and talked, celebrating their own victories and milestones, completely unaware that his world had just fallen apart. He paid the bill without touching his food and walked out into the cool night air. The city stretched out before him, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one dealing with their own complicated messes. He stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, and for the first time in years he had absolutely no idea what to do next. His phone buzzed. For a wild moment he thought it might be Rachel, saying she had changed her mind, that she was willing to wait while he sorted himself out, but it was just a notification from his email app. Jennifer's message still sat there undeleted, like a door left slightly ajar. David started walking. He had no destination in mind, just a need to move, to think, to process everything that had happened in the span of one evening. His mind kept replaying the night like a movie stuck on loop.
Jennifer's apology.
Rachel's tears. The moment of hesitation that had cost him everything. He found himself in front of his office building without consciously deciding to go there. The lobby was empty except for the night security guard who nodded at him as he passed. David took the elevator up to his floor, the doors opening onto the dark, quiet space where he had spent so much of his life. He flipped on the lights in his office and stood at the window, looking out at the same city view he had been admiring from the restaurant. Up here, in this space he had built through sheer determination and countless sacrifices, he thought he would feel some sense of pride or accomplishment. Instead, he just felt empty. On his desk was a framed photo from the day they closed the acquisition deal. He was shaking hands with the CEO of the company that had bought his startup, surrounded by his team, everyone smiling for the camera. This was supposed to be the happy ending. This was what he had given up everything for. But what had he actually won? David pulled out his phone and opened Jennifer's email again. "Some doors are meant to stay closed," she had written. The words felt like wisdom he needed to hear but didn't want to accept. He thought about that night 5 years ago when she had packed her bags and walked out. He had been so sure he was making the right choice, that his company had to come first, that real success required real sacrifice, and he had succeeded. The company was thriving. He had more money than he knew what to do with. His name was in business magazines. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve. So why did he feel like he had lost something far more valuable? His phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. It was his best friend Kevin, probably calling to ask how the celebration dinner went. David let it ring. He wasn't ready to explain this disaster to anyone yet. Instead, He opened his contacts and scrolled to Rachel's name. His finger hovered over the call button. What would he even say? That he was sorry? That he had figured everything out? That would be a lie. He was more confused now than he had been at dinner. The truth was, Jennifer had been right about something all those years ago. He had been obsessed. He had put his company above everything else in his life, including the people who cared about him. And even now, after achieving everything he wanted professionally, he wasn't sure he had learned his lesson. Rachel had been patient with his schedule, understanding about late nights and missed plans. But patience and understanding weren't the same as being truly prioritized. Had he just found someone who made it easier for him to keep making the same mistakes? Someone who wouldn't challenge him the way Jennifer had? David sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. He pulled up the email Jennifer had sent and hit reply. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before he started typing. Jennifer, thank you for your message. You didn't make things awkward. I did, by not being honest about my own feelings. Seeing you tonight made me realize I've been running from that night for 5 years, trying to prove to myself that choosing my company was the right decision. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But I think I've been so focused on building something successful that I forgot to build a life worth living. I'm sorry for my part in how things ended between us. I hope you find what you're looking for. Take care. David. He read the message 3 times before hitting send. It wasn't a declaration of love or a request for another chance. It was just honesty, the kind he should have offered 5 years ago instead of silence. Then he opened a new message to Rachel. This one was harder to write. He typed and deleted several versions before finally settling on something that felt true. Rachel, I'm sorry for tonight. You deserved better than my confusion and hesitation. You were right about everything. I was comparing you to Jennifer, wondering about the past, not being fully present with you. That's not fair to you, and it's not the foundation for a real relationship. You deserve someone who chooses you without question, without hesitation, without doubt. I thought I was that person, but tonight showed me I'm not ready to be. I need to figure out who I am outside of my work, what I actually want from life beyond professional success. I care about you deeply, and that's exactly why I need to let you go. You deserve someone whole, and right now I'm still broken in ways I didn't realize. I'm sorry. David. He sent that message too, and immediately felt the weight of it. He had just walked away from a good woman who loved him, not because he didn't care about her, but because she deserved better than what he could offer right now. His phone buzzed almost immediately. Rachel's response was short. Thank you for being honest. I hope you find what you're looking for. No anger, no bitterness, just grace. That somehow made it hurt more. David closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. The office around him, this space he had sacrificed so much to build, suddenly felt like a monument to the wrong priorities. He had proven he could build a successful company, but he had failed at the more important things, maintaining relationships, being present, understanding what actually mattered in life. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Kevin texting instead of calling. Dude, you alive? How'd the big celebration go? David stared at the message for a moment before typing back. It was a disaster. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? I need to talk. Kevin's response was immediate. Of course, 9 a.m. at the usual place. See you then, David typed back. He stood up and looked around his office one more time. Tomorrow he would start figuring out who David was beyond his job title and bank account. Tomorrow he would start the harder work of building a life instead of just a career. But tonight, he just needed to sit with the consequences of his choices. David turned off the lights and headed home. The city was quieter now, most people already asleep, preparing for another day of chasing their own versions of success. He walked slowly, in no hurry to get anywhere, just putting one foot in front of the other. When he got home, his apartment felt too big and too empty. He had bought it 6 months ago, a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture, the kind of place that looked impressive in real estate magazines. But it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a hotel room, a temporary place where he slept between work obligations. He made himself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, looking out at the city lights. His phone sat silent on the coffee table. No calls from Rachel asking him to reconsider. No messages from Jennifer opening old doors. Just silence and his own thoughts. David thought about the question Rachel had asked him at dinner. If Jennifer walked back in and wanted another chance, what would you say? At the time, he hadn't known the answer. But sitting here now in the quiet of his empty apartment, he realized the question itself was wrong. It didn't matter what he would say to Jennifer if she wanted another chance. What mattered was understanding why he had hesitated when Rachel asked. Why, after 8 months with a woman who was good to him and good for him, he couldn't answer that question with immediate certainty. The problem wasn't Jennifer or Rachel. The problem was him. He had spent so many years defining himself by his work, by his achievements, by his ability to build and create and succeed, that he had never stopped to figure out who he was without all of that. He didn't know how to be in a relationship without turning it into another project to manage or another goal to achieve. He didn't know how to be present with someone without part of his mind already racing ahead to the next problem that needed solving. Jennifer had been right to leave 5 years ago. Not because he was selfish, but because he wasn't ready to be what she needed. And the painful truth was, 5 years and all his success later, he still wasn't ready. He had changed professionally, but not personally. He had grown his business, but not himself. David pulled out a notebook and started writing. Not a business plan or a strategy document, but just thoughts, questions, realizations. What did he actually want from life? What made him happy beyond closing deals and hitting targets? What kind of person did he want to be? What kind of partner? What kind of friend? He wrote until the sun started to rise, filling page after page with the kind of honest self-examination he had been avoiding for years. And somewhere in those pages, he began to see a path forward. Not back to Jennifer or back to Rachel, but forward to becoming someone who could actually handle a real relationship without sabotaging it with work obsession or emotional unavailability. The sun was fully up when he finally stopped writing. He had a coffee date with Kevin in 2 hours. Then he had a full day at work, meetings and decisions and all the usual demands on his time and attention. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, David wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about change. Real change. The kind that couldn't be achieved through hard work and determination alone, but required honesty and vulnerability and the courage to admit he didn't have all the answers. David showered and dressed, looking at himself in the mirror. Same face, same expensive suit, same CEO who had just closed the biggest deal of his career. But something was different. Maybe it was just awareness, or maybe it was the first step toward actually becoming the person he wanted to be. He grabbed his keys and headed out the door. The city was waking up, people rushing to work, starting another day in their own complicated lives. David joined the flow of humanity, just another person trying to figure things out, one day at a time. And for once, that felt like enough.